Hi there, I'm Jake. Welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. You know, there's a phrase that I have heard for just about as long as I can remember. Practice makes perfect. And I think we can all admit that that phrase is a little bit imperfect. And people have tried to reinvent it. Practice makes permanent, or perfect practice makes perfect. But all of those are a little bit insufficient. And for a game like Magic the Gathering, I think practice is hard, and most Magic players don't even know how. So today I want to talk about how we practice Magic the Gathering. So pull up a chair and have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake, let's talk games. So I think it's best if we start with a question. Is practice even necessary? The reality is, it might not be. Each person learns in a slightly different way, and I think there's definitely people that can improve their gameplay in Magic the Gathering simply by reading deck lists, watching YouTube videos, understanding the mechanics of the decks at play. And so by the time they sit down at the table, they are ready to go. But for most of us, I think the hands-on approach is better. And sometimes that is just digitally on Arena. But I like playing the deck. I like experiencing that gameplay. And when we talk about practicing, it's important to distinguish between practicing with the deck and just playing a deck. Because I understand the need to just play the game. Just enjoy it, sit down, have a good time with friends, but I don't think that necessarily counts as practice. When you're practicing with your deck, you're trying to find optimal plays, ways to improve, cards you can swap out. You're trying to understand the decks you're playing against, what the general metagame looks like, what landscape you're going to be walking into at a competitive level. So let's start by talking about how we practice when we're all alone. We're going to start with goldfishing. So when we talk about goldfishing with the deck, I think there's two main directions that we go. One deck or two. When we goldfish with one deck, our goals are to understand our own gameplay. What we are doing on curve, which cards we want to search for with our tutors. We want to have specific lines in mind, specific combos that we are trying to execute. Sometimes that's fairly straightforward. We know A plus B equals win. And so we try to jam that out as fast as possible. We try to see how much protection we can hold up. Having a game plan for how to get around those different obstacles is an important part of goldfishing. Maybe it's just mulligan strategy. Shuffle up, see what happens if you take your initial 7, play that out, and then say, what happens if I didn't take that initial 7? And you go down to 6, and try playing it out at 6. Try playing it out at 5 or 4. Draw a few different hands and see how low you can go before your deck can't perform, before it can't hit the things that it needs on curve to actually play the game. I think there's a lot of benefits to goldfishing with the deck, to figuring out the best way to play the deck in a vacuum. But when we play Magic, we're not actually playing in a vacuum. And so to just set those benchmarks, I think it can be really helpful to goldfish with two decks. Basically, the second deck, you just play it dumb, right? It's just going to play one thing every turn, and it's going to put up a few obstacles, and you're going to see if your deck can knock those down. You don't have to get super involved with the second deck, you just want to see what your opponent might have. Because the reality is, they can't have everything. I think one of the big mistakes that people make when they're goldfishing or trying something like this, they assume that their opponent is holding up counter magic, has a bunch of creatures in play, has removal at their disposal, and has all of the mana that they should. And the reality is no deck is going to have all of those pieces at the same time. When you're playing Commander, it can feel like that because you have 3 opponents, so some combination of their cards probably tick all of those boxes. But 1v1, your deck has to make choices. and you can only include certain aspects before it becomes muddled and doesn't really perform the way you want it to. So goldfish with that in mind, goldfish against decks that you think are big threats to you, just to see what they might be holding in their hand at any given time. You can even do this on something like Moxfield. You can pull a list and play that digitally with your deck on the table in front of you, and you can see what type of stuff they draw into while you are playing out your cards. It's a good way to just test it out without having the pressure of an opponent sitting against you. I know that it can be kind of stressful to be playing a deck for the first time in a group of other people. So just being able to kind of go through the motions, get a feel for what you were trying to accomplish, it can be really, really helpful. In fact, I remember a time goldfishing with my old casual elf deck when I was playing, assuming that my opponent was going to destroy one creature every turn. And I was looking for a good way to get around that. Assuming that my opponent was playing a very heavy, oppressive deck, how can I play through that? And I started looking at different options for sideboard. I think this sort of thought exercise is really useful for breaking down which cards you want to have in your sideboard. And in this case, with that heavy removal, with my creatures constantly being sent to the graveyard, I realized that having a good response for losing that momentum is critical. And the card that I landed on was Caller of the Claw. It's a creature that when it comes into play makes a 2/2 bear for each creature that died this turn. And multiple times I caught my opponent off guard when they get a Wrath of God at just the right time, wipe my entire board, and then I'm able to refill with 5 or 6 bears. And that's usually enough to get the job done. So goldfishing against theoretical opponents that are using atypical strategies can really help you flesh out the rest of your deck and the sideboard to go along with it. But if we do have access to another player, if we do have an opportunity to test our deck out, I think that's the real test. That's the real practice. And when we sit down at a table against a real opponent, I think it's important to keep in mind every action that happens before, during, and after the game. So now, let's talk about real practice. So you're sitting across the table from a real opponent, or opponents, and you have an opportunity to play your deck in person. I said that it's important to think about what to do before, during, and after the game. But most of the before is the goldfishing, the theory crafting, the deck building. And so there's not a whole lot you can do once you're at the table. But there is one thing, and I would encourage everybody to do this. Before they start a game, just pick up your whole deck and look through it. Make sure that the cards you are expecting to be in there are in there. Familiarize yourself with what you have in your sideboard to make that transition from game 1 to 2 a little bit smoother. You can look at what your opponent's doing and have a pretty good idea of what you need to bring in to solve those problems. You don't want to be stuck in the position where you are searching for something that doesn't exist. In Commander, this happens a lot. But I think that just by looking through your deck before the game begins, you can stop a lot of those mistakes. You can catch yourself before you run into those issues. But during the game, there's a lot we can do. And if we're practicing, if we are trying to improve, I think there's a couple big things that we need to be aware of. And the first is choices. Whenever you reach a fork in the road, multiple cards that can be cast at the same time, and just identify which path you took. Last night I actually had this. I was playing CEDH, and in my hand I had a Ruination and the One Ring. Now these two cards are very different in the impact that they have on the table. I feel like the One Ring is a stabilizing card. It allows me to refuel my hand, it gives me protection for a turn, and it can stop certain win conditions from being possible at all. But the other is a win condition. Ruination ends the game for a lot of decks. If I'm able to take out all of your 3 or 4 starting lands, you're not recovering. There's very few decks that can play through this. My personal mantra is make them have it, right? If you're playing into a table like that, and this is going to win you the game, well, go for it. I think doing the math, I should have gone for the one ring, and I ended up not winning this game, and Ruination ended up getting countered. But the number of counters that were out on the table would have probably been enough to get it back to me without losing just with the one ring. So I probably should have gone the opposite direction, and it's important to note those things after the game concludes. But during the game, just make that checklist. Just identify where you went with path A versus path B. The second thing you want to be aware of during a game is what your opponents are doing. The benefit of playing against live people is that you can see how they react. You can see the thought process that they use when they're playing that deck. I think there's a certain degree of personality that goes into people's gameplay, but a lot of that gameplay is driven by the deck list itself. And there's going to be enough overlap between those different decks that you can get a feel for a few different archetypes and a few different decks that you can start cataloging those away, knowing what they do next, what responses they have, how likely they are to have a force of will, or a negate, or a fatal push in their deck. But after the game wraps up, win or lose, I think there's a lot we can do. And if we're trying to get better at Magic, the single best thing that we can do, the single best practice we can have, is after the game. After the dust is settled, after we know who won, and after we know which decisions were right. Because again, after the game, I now know the one ring was the right play. Ruination just didn't get it done. So now we get to the after party. We know how the game went. We know how our deck performed. We know the decks that we were up against, and we know what choices were made in and out of game. So how do we improve? And I think mostly we look back. We determine which choices we made that were inefficient. Think back to the Ruination and the One Ring. I think pretty clearly the One Ring was the right choice. But I think it can help illuminate some other aspects. How long do we hold on to that counterspell? What are we looking to stop? Which silver bullets were a problem for us? Maybe when do we play out our tent post commander? The one that is absolutely crucial for our deck being able to do what it wants to do. How aggressively do we mulligan? When we tutor for cards, when do we look for the cards that move us forward versus the cards that pull everyone else back? I think that post-game recap is absolutely critical to improving in Magic the Gathering. I think the first time that I realized I was actually getting good at the game was after a Friday Night Magic. It was a standard tournament, and I was running Elves. This was probably somewhere around Lorwyn. And after the game, I started walking back through the decisions I made, and I realized if I had taken one more swing with the Llanowar Elf on turn 2, where I ended up not using the mana, and I didn't need to use it to block, I'd have gotten an extra damage in, and that would have given me enough damage to close out the game. Because in the second to last turn, I chose not to attack, because I would have put my opponent to 1, and he would have killed off half my board, and I wouldn't have been in a position to get an extra swing in. But that chain of events, that butterfly effect, over the course of the game, would have changed things into a win for me. And I think when you can look back and identify where those key points are, you've gotten much better at the game. I think that post-game wrap-up is the most important part of practice. If you have the opportunity, write things down. So afterwards you can look back at your notes and see what decisions you made and why. It allows you to improve your gameplay while not playing the game. There's no rush here. You can take your time. You can think back over it. Try again. Sit down with the same people with the same decks and say, let's run it back. I'm a little curious whether my deck does that every time. If you struggle in the same way, at some point you might want to make some adjustments. But the most poisonous thing you can do to your deck is make changes after every game. Play it enough that you notice the consistent problems or the consistent successes. In my CEDH deck, the Gitrog monster, there's 3 main components that I need. My commander, a discard outlet, and Dakmor Salvage. Now, obviously, the hardest thing to get here is Dakmor Salvage. So when I'm tutoring for a card and I don't have either of these, discard outlet or Dakmor Salvage, I grab the land. There's times when I play the land. The deck has a lot of ways of sacrificing things. But there are definitely times when I search for neither of these. Sometimes I'm searching for something like Doomsday that can end the game in a different way, put me in a position to draw into these cards, guaranteed. And sometimes I'm searching for Abrupt Decay because it's the only thing that stops my opponents from winning. But knowing which decision to make and when is something that I've learned from iterating on this. Playing this deck a bunch, trying out different things, identifying which are successful and which are not. The when and where and why of the cards that I play and the cards that I search for come from practice. So now let's cycle back to that first statement. Practice makes perfect. In a game like Magic, I don't know that you can necessarily say anything makes perfect. It's a game of branching decisions with real live opponents that have their own decks that they've built and are playing. Your deck is composed of choices of cards from hundreds of thousands of options. There is no way to play perfectly. All we can do is tailor our decks to play the way that we want them to play. We can play our decks in a way that we present ourselves with options, and we know what those options lead to by the experience of past games that we've had. We can take the time after we play these games to identify what was the right option. Where should we have gone at various points in the game? And we can use this practice, we can use this iteration with our decks to identify what we might want to do next. And sometimes that might be not practicing at all. Sometimes I just want to sit down with my SpongeBob Joda deck and play out all of the Final Fantasy Legends just because it's fun to swing with big creatures. There's a lot of different ways of playing Magic, and there's a lot of different ways of practicing Magic. But if you are interested in getting better at Magic, I encourage you to take the time between games to just learn a little more about your deck, about your opponent's deck, and try a few different ways that you wouldn't normally play during the game. Make the weird choice. Make them have it. Find a few new ways to practice, and let me know how it goes. Let me know if there is some method that you like to use to learn a new deck. A method that you like to use to get better in a given format. And if you're the type of person that always plays that anti-meta, weird, called shot deck that somehow sneaks into the top 8 in a way that nobody's ever seen before, I'd love to hear about that too. Thanks for watching.